So this story struck me. It was about a week ago in the Washington Post. The headline, put the headline up there again, Jesus. Again, from the Washington Post, it says JFK's dirty tricks was the headline. And the headline to me, and I was intrigued, obviously, because A, I love dirty tricks, and it's a headline about JFK. It's totally an intriguing headline. You see it right there. JFK's own dirty tricks are the headline. So I read the story. And it's written by a guy named Mark Feldstein. He's a media public affairs professor at GW, George Washington. He's written a book called Poisoning the Press, Richard Nixon, Jack Anderson, and the Rise of Washington's Scandal Culture. So before we get to our guest, I want to just give a quick little synopsis of what this is so we can talk a little more about these. So Nixon was very angry after the 1960 election, and he thought that Kennedy had stolen it from him. But what Feldstein argues is that it was much more than ballot stuffing, which is what Nixon maintained, specifically in West Virginia and Chicago. And it says here the dirty tricks were, he says, one of the least known chapters of 20th century political history. Burglary, in fact, on the eve of the 1960 election. So word spread close to the election day that Nixon had secretly pocketed money from Howard Hughes, the billionaire, who's had a secret, whose a far-flung business empire, it reads here, was dependent on government contracts and connections. Of course, what we still know, what Cenk talks about, still true today, the sort of corporate interests that are still very tied to government. And Hughes was significantly interested in Nixon winning so he could maintain his government contracts, his connections to power. And he had secretly funneled $205,000 to Nixon. That's worth $1.6 million today. It's a lot of money. That he'd given to Nixon. That's illegal money, right? Using various intermediaries, he'd gotten that money there. That story had been confirmed by Time magazine and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. But that story had been held by papers, those publications, because they didn't want to influence the election. They were like, it's a little close to the election. Like, I mean, it's crazy.
That's so ridiculous. But your job as a journalist is to not care about whether or not you're influencing the election. You're supposed to report the truth.
Right. You get it.
If it's the truth, you report it.
If you get it 2 days after the election, you report it then. You get it 2 days before the election. I would try to get it before the election. It's a little bit bigger of a story.
Right.
That's the way I'd go, because you know what? People might want that information. If you
That's
know it's true.
incredible.
If you don't know it's true, then you don't report.
You know, it's amazing because the mainstream media is broken now, and it was broken back then as well.
So the Kennedy people are obviously, they're interested in getting that story out before the election. I get that. So they go to two columnists who are liberal columnists who are loyal to them. And they essentially give the information to them. And those guys run it. And you can call that some sort of breach of journalistic ethics. That's fine. That's also could be true. But they give it to them. Those guys run it. The story breaks. How did the Kennedy people get that information becomes the story. And apparently how they did it was they paid $100,000, the equivalent of $100,000. So that reads like 10 grand, 8 grand, something back then, to an LA accountant. And that accountant was a Democrat who had a falling out with his partners. And apparently what had happened, that accountant had contacted Bobby Kennedy, obviously Jack's brother, and then a break-in occurred at the accountant's old office, and that information was in the office. So clearly what would appear to have happened is that accountant said, hey, look, I had a falling out with my partners, this information is there, maybe you want to break into the office. The break-in happens, the Kennedy people get the information, they leak it, the information is true, and this gets referred to as JFK's dirty tricks. And it seems to me what most relevant is, this is a true story about Howard Hughes' massive illegal donations to Richard Nixon, and the story is painted as Nixon was angry, and what's significant about it is Nixon thought, I'm never going to lose an election like this again, this is how politics are played, and then he breaks into the Watergate building, to the Democratic offices of the Watergate building, where he finds nothing except steals a bunch of political secrets so that he can beat George McGovern. The stories are incredibly different. What it reveals, we already know Nixon's an anti-Semite, almost certainly a racist, and a criminal. But this is, yeah, okay, the Kennedys played hardball, and there's a problem with the break-in. But again, the information they got was true, and it's most revealing, again, about Nixon. And he was a criminal in 1960, and he was a criminal in 1972. And I'm sure if we looked further back, he's always been a criminal.
Yeah, the angle of that Washington Post article is completely wrong.
They're
Instead of focusing on the most important aspect of that story, they're focusing on what JFK did wrong. But what he did wrong revealed the truth about Nixon.
They're missing the point. Joining us now, former Bobby Kennedy press secretary while he was in the Senate, and then during his 1968 run for president, Frank Mankiewicz, who happens to be my father. Dad, how are you?
Hey, I'm fine. Who wrote that story?
Mark Feldstein. He's written a book called Poisoning the Press, Richard Nixon, Jack Anderson, and the Rise of Washington's Scandal Culture. Do you know him?
Well, I don't know anything about the book, but the story is wholly fictitious.
Oh, really? What part of it is fictitious?
Everybody knew about the Hughes money going to Nixon for years before that.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Dick Tuck did some wonderful things with it because Nixon wouldn't. It was masked as a loan to Nixon's brother.
And who is Dick Tuck, for people who don't know?
Dick Tuck is a historic. He's dead now, alas. A historic prankster.
But you don't mean like prankster, like the
way
like there was a prankster in
eighth
grade.
Nixon train, he put on a conductor's cap and got off the train and waved to the engineer to get started while Nixon was giving a speech from the rear of the train.
So like the train would start while Nixon was giving the speech?
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
So the train lurched forward. And he did a couple of great things with Howard Hughes' loan, because Nixon wouldn't talk about it, but everybody knew he'd loaned Donald Nixon, I think it was $200,000. And, of course, it was really a masked campaign contribution. And they wouldn't talk about it. And when Nixon went to Chinatown in San Francisco to give a speech toward the end of the campaign, Tuck arranged to have a banner in Chinese characters flown above the street. Like in Reno, it's this biggest little city in the world.
Right.
Well, this said in Chinese, everybody thought it said, "Greetings, Richard Nixon," but it didn't. What it said was, "Ask him about the Hughes loan." And then he had that same message in all of the fortune cookies that were distributed at the luncheon.
So they always.
We all knew about the Hughes loan. That's crazy. But I will tell you another story about Nixon, which makes him not a prankster or dirty tricks, but an out-and-out criminal. And it's on tape, his tapes. There came a time in the 1972 campaign when George Wallace, who was a tough third-party candidate as far as Nixon was concerned, because he would take some racist votes away from Nixon when he needed all of them. And somebody shot Nixon, a guy named Arthur Bremer.
Somebody shot Wallace.
Huh?
Somebody shot Wallace.
Shot Wallace, I'm sorry. Shot him on the 15th of May in Maryland. And Wallace was rushed to a hospital. And Nixon, that day, called in Chuck Colson, one of his top henchmen, and said, "Look, this guy Bremer who shot Wallace, he lives in Milwaukee. He has an apartment there, and here's his address. Send some guys there before the FBI gets there, and break in and tell them to spread McGovern literature."
And it's an unbelievable story.
Now, that's a crime. That's not a dirty trick.
Yeah, it's not a little crime, too. I mean, it's obstruction.
Right.
It's a huge, serious crime. It's obstruction of justice, and it's also incredibly immoral.
Yes, it is.
Right.
And Colson came back later and said to him, "I'm sorry, Chief, but the FBI beat us to it."
I mean, they were already there investigating.
They're already there.
That's
all on tape.
Yeah. It's
all you have to do is go to the archives and ask for it, and they'll play it for you.
It's an unbelievable story about Richard Nixon. Yeah. Do you think that this sort of that the lesson of 1960 for Richard Nixon was that politics is hardball, with the notion that he lost this election because that story broke late, even whether people knew about it for a long time, but that it broke right before the election? You think
it's preposterous because the story didn't break that much. I mean, the story of the Hughes loan was known around before the end of that campaign.
Well, but it broke
a hell of a lot more publicity the last week.
Right, but it got a lot of publicity the last week, and that he sort of felt that this is the way. And then the arguments about the sort of the ballot stuffing and what happened in West Virginia and what happened in Illinois. That he thought, okay, the politics is played differently, and this is how I'm going to do it.
Well, Illinois, you gotta pay attention to, because there are a lot of people who to this day think that Kennedy didn't win Illinois legally, that they stuffed the ballot box or something. The fact is, he won by enough of a margin so that if Nixon had carried Illinois, it wouldn't have made any difference. That's the first thing. Second thing is that the Republicans made such a big deal of it after the election that a special committee was appointed to be chaired by Everett Dirksen, who was then the Republican senator from Illinois,
Right.
to investigate whether they had indeed stuffed the ballot boxes in Illinois, either in the city, which is what Nixon claimed, or, as it turned out, downstate, which was heavy Republican country and where they were, suspected of the same thing. And the conclusion of the commission was that the two sort of balanced out, that neither one affected the result of the election in Illinois.
Okay, Dad, last question. You got to decide in 10 seconds or less.
10 seconds or less?
Yeah. We got two questions. First of all, who was a worse president, Richard Nixon or George Bush? The second George Bush.
Oh, I think George Bush.
Okay, all right, that was good. Who's a worse guy, Richard Nixon or Dick Cheney?
Nixon or Cheney?
Yeah.
Oh, I think Nixon.
All right. Interesting. I thought you would have gone. Cheney.
No, Cheney was just, kind of a corrupt big businessman.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Sophisticated, thoughtful answers, Dad.
A lot of people who knew Cheney say he was really a fairly decent fellow. I mean, just to meet and be with, whereas Nixon was almost impossible.
Nixon never shot one of his friends in the face.
No, but it could have been accidental, huh?
That's what they want you to believe.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know.
How was Sergeant Shriver's memorial?
Very moving. It really was. They had a lot of talented people volunteered, and the children had nice things to say. One of the grandchildren all spoke, and one of them you'll be happy to take a little common interest with. Teenager, he's probably, 18, 19 years old. I don't know whose son he is, but he's son of one of Shriver's kids. And he was talking about his grandfather, and they were all saying, "Grandpa, thanks for this, and thanks for telling me about baseball, and everything." And this kid said, at the end of his little speech, he said, "And thank you, Grandpa, for this wonderful head of hair."
Oh, believe me, I thank my grandfather on my mother's side every day for that.
I'm sure you do.
Yeah, I don't thank you in any way, shape, or form.
No, indeed, not for hair.
You made no contribution to that at all. All right, Dad, thank you very much.
All right,
Talk
to you later.
Have a good night.